Good evening to all of you, especially our friars who have come from Assisi and our Methodists who have come from a little ways down the road, as it were. We are quite a reduced number this evening, but it certainly is a shame that they're going to miss the high quality of what we're about to hear. Dr. Tom Best is a close friend who has collaborated for many years with us at the Centro and with me personally in Faith and Order and in many other projects that he has been spearheading. He is an ordained minister of the Disciples of Christ, and also the editor of the volume of international dialogues, which he has done now for several series, as well as many other books that have been issued by Faith and Order. Tom comes to us from the United States. And we're very pleased that he made the long trip across the Atlantic, a little bit tiring, but that he is here with us. And in the middle of Advent, it's good to have a theme of hope. And so his talk this evening is going to be precisely that, because in case anyone missed it, the ecumenical winter has come to an end. Tom Best.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. Before I start, I would like to remind us of two great churchmen, Archbishop Johanna Ibrahim and Archbishop Paul Yatsigi, kidnapped by gunmen on 23 April, 7 years ago, on their way back from the Turkish border to their city of Aleppo. Johanna Ibrahim was a particular acquaintance of mine and an ecumenical servant. He was the one who arranged to have baptism, Eucharist, and ministry translated into Arabic. There's no word of the fate of these men, whether dead, whether alive. We wait news of their fate, and they are not forgotten. Thank you. At my age, you will forgive me for hoping that you do not regard this evening as an exercise in the veneration of relics. And now more seriously, what an honor to speak again at the Centro. I last spoke for the 50th anniversary of the Centro and concluded my presentation with Mother Lurana White's comment about the Society of the Atonement having created an octave of prayer for Christian unity. So it's especially meaningful to me to be speaking now at your 25th annual conference in honor of Paul Wattson and Lurana White. So thank you, Father Puglisi, Jim, for the invitation. I have to confess, I never quite believed in the notion of an ecumenical winter in which nothing was happening. After all, winter is the season of lying fallow, gathering resources and strength for the time ahead. Plus, there is that ultimate word on winter, the two-line poem by the great American poet Emily Dickinson, as follows. Winter, under cultivation, is as arable as spring. And we have been cultivating. But the term ecumenical winter stuck, and as language can do, it became fixed and hardened over the years, something which is a very bad issue for a movement which expresses itself in that language. So I hope tonight we can put that language behind us and look forward instead. I hope to briefly note a few personal fundamentals, just principles which continue to inspire and challenge our movement, a very personal short list. Second, to look briefly at some of the challenges and critiques facing the ecumenical movement today. Third, to justify my hopelessly bold title by reminding us of just some of the many recent advances ecumenically. And fourth, to end with a note of hope and challenge as we move forward. I arrived in a faraway country for an ecumenical conference. I met a local pastor also attending the conference. It seemed that this ecumenical event was for him a kind of escape from his regular parish duties, a kind of holiday, if you will. So when he asked me, "And what do you do in real life?" I said instinctively, for me, this is real life. And recognized at that moment that I was there not just doing my job, but practicing my vocation to help restore the unity of Christ's church. Not only individuals have an ecumenical vocation, it is the vocation of the one church of Jesus Christ. And while the church itself could not lose that vocation, the churches could lose the vocation and had done so over the centuries. The 20th century was then the century in which the churches rediscovered their ecumenical vocation and began seeking to fulfill it. So my first fundamental is ecumenism is a vocation we practice, not a job we do. It is, of course, based upon our fundamental biblical mandate, Jesus' prayer in John 17:21, that they may all be one, so that the world may believe that you sent me. Unity is our nature, but also the basis of our credibility before the world. Unity is given by God, but that unity must be made visible in the actual lives of churches today. A next fundamental is the week of prayer in its fullness, noting that after the Episcopalian, Paul Wattson, brought his prayer octave into the Catholic Church through his conversion to Rome, Episcopalians, disciples of Christ, and other Protestants brought their own vision of prayer for unity into the nascent faith and order movement, so that parallel streams of prayer for unity, Catholic and Protestant, flourished through the 1920s. These streams were ready then to find a common focus through Abbé Couturier's vision of the unity Christ wills and by the means which Christ wills. It's no longer a hidden secret that already in the 1950s, the Centro Ecumenical in Lyon and Faith and Order in Geneva were quietly preparing together a common week of prayer text. And of course, this became the open official norm after the Second Vatican Council. The week of prayer stands, I believe, as the longest-running common ecumenical endeavor among Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox churches, and is the basis for what we now call spiritual ecumenism. A further personal fundamental, the definition of organic unity from the Second World Conference on Faith and Order in Edinburgh in 1937. In another quirk of language, this term somehow became identified with the kind of rigid uniformity But the original definition explicitly rejects, quote, a compact governmental union involving rigid uniformity, and offers instead, quote, the unity of a living organism with the diversity characteristic of the members of a healthy body. That is the definition of organic unity from the ecumenical movement. Edinburgh said as follows, in a church so united organically, the ultimate loyalty of every member would be given to the whole body and not to any one part of it. Its members would move freely from one part to another and find every privilege of membership open to them. Its sacraments would be the sacraments of the whole body, and the ministry would be accepted by all as a ministry of the whole body. Is this not, finally, the goal of our search for Christian unity today? Sharing the gifts of our respective ecclesial traditions while offering a common and credible witness and service to the world within a common framework of confession of the one faith, mutual recognition of sacraments and ministries, and an appropriate practice of common deliberation and decision-making. A next personal fundamental is the witness of united and uniting churches. Churches once divided, now united within a single ecclesial structure. Their most dramatic ecclesiological witness is that of the Church of South India, formed from diverse Protestant churches and the Anglican Church, and thus incorporating the office of a sacramentally understood bishop within the structure of the united church. It is, in fact, possible for Anglicans and Presbyterians to live together within a single united church structure. From the United and Uniting Churches movement comes perhaps the most poignant statement of the longing for Christian unity that I know. The great ecumenical theologian and missionary bishop Leslie Newbigin described his ecclesial anguish on returning to his native England after long service in India. For 27 years, he wrote, I had been a bishop in the Church of South India. We had been innocent enough to hope that 3 decades would be enough to enable the divided churches in England to catch up with India. For all these years in the United Church of South India, we had lived in a fellowship where the treasures of the Anglican, Methodist, and Reformed traditions were all ours to share. Now, back in England, we faced the painful necessity of choosing which denominational slot to go into. The most dramatic social witness to complete the picture of united and uniting churches is the union in apartheid South Africa of divided white, black, and colored churches to form a single ecclesial body. The divided races found their unity within the one body of Christ in utter defiance of everything the surrounding culture did to keep them apart. A final personal foundation is the so-called Lund Principle from the Third World Conference on Faith and Order in 1951. Lund wrote, and if I'm not mistaken, the main drafter was Leslie Newbigin, a faith in the one church of Jesus Christ, which is not implemented by acts of obedience, is dead. There are truths about the nature of God and his church, which will remain forever closed to us unless we act together in obedience to the unity which is already ours. Should not our churches ask themselves whether they should not act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately? At one stroke, the focus shifted from how the churches differ to what we have in common, to the conviction that we have a sufficient basis for common mission, diaconia, and social witness to be the norm, with divided action by the churches the exception. The Lund principle has taken on a certain life of its own as a basis for our ecumenical life, including, where possible, common confession and worship. Like many memorable ecumenical statements, it is put as a question, in effect, a challenge. I promise you a dramatic example later on of how Lund continues to bear fruit. This personal list of fundamentals could be extended, but these are some of the principles I find especially significant and challenging for our ecumenical situation today. But we no longer live in the world of Christendom, in which these fundamental principles and the ecumenical movement itself was born and developed. No one has analyzed this more perceptively than Bishop Brian Farrell, speaking at this very podium in January of 2020. Drawing on the second Faith and Order Convergence text, The Church Towards a Common Vision, of 2013, he noted three developments which shape our current church and ecumenical environment. First, a global secularizing culture in which God is not necessary, and society is organized without any reference to transcendent truths or values. Secondly, he noted social media in which views are no longer based on reality and experience, but on virtual reality and the emotions that arouses, leading to the loss of the sense of committed belonging. And third, a religious pluralism in which all religions are present everywhere, and civil legislation more and more requires that all religions be treated as equally valid and equally irrelevant in determining social values and laws. In short, as I would put it for today, we have the answers, but the secular world has simply stopped asking the questions, because the questions themselves seem irrelevant to secular people increasingly today. And even among churchgoers, our ecumenical endeavors may seem irrelevant, as Bishop Walter Casper noted, again at this very podium, saying, "We are often too concerned with our own old problems, which are perhaps of interest for theologically trained people, but of no relevance for normal people, instead of taking up the very existential problems of everyday people, including often enough our own faithful." As we know, this is especially true among young people who, as Sarah Coakley notes, if they have maintained their Christian practice at all, are weary of ecclesiastical divisions, which they see as a diversion from the urgent, indeed potentially catastrophic, spiritual and political challenges of our day. And while, through God's grace, some churches are flourishing in the global South and in the North. Brian Farrell is right in saying that secularism and relativism are not just ideas being propounded by Northern elites. They are now the dominant organizing criteria of not only the Western First World, but more are becoming a global aspiration. Even churches may find our ecumenical exertions of little interest to their perceived needs. I spoke about baptism, Eucharist, and ministry at the Pacific Conference of Churches in 1986, explicating its skillful handling of the classic theological and ecclesiological causes of division among the churches. Afterwards, a delegate arose and said, "Thank you, Faith and Order, for sending us BEM. Until you sent us BEM, we never knew we had these problems." The churches there enjoyed a flourishing ecumenical life, untroubled, perhaps they should have been troubled, but untroubled by the theological and ecclesiological divisions which were important elsewhere, but not to them in their context, as they understood it. And beyond all of this, and much more radically, is the rise of a global Christianity movement, through which churches in the global South are finding their own and increasingly critical indigenous voice, critical of churches in the North and the ecumenism which is identified with them. In this post-colonialist view, the divisions of the North are not simply irrelevant for churches in the South, but in fact a source of oppression. In some quarters, there are calls for a letting go of the old ecumenism, meaning us, in order that a new ecumenism may be born, one finally relevant to churches in the South. This is harsh language indeed, and engaging it is beyond the scope of my presentation. But I hope to show that we are hearing this critique and beginning to deal with it. And Jim has promised you hope, so it's time I delivered some. This brings me to what we might call recent signs of ecumenical flourishing. First and most basic is the fact that ecumenism is in fact embedded in the lives of many churches today. Most of the faithful think of themselves as baptized into Christ and as being members of Christ's one body, the church, rather than in the first instance members of their particular denomination. The churches themselves think of themselves as expressions of Christ's body. Susan Derber notes that the ordination service of her own church, the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom, asks candidates to promise the following: to cherish love towards all other churches and to endeavor always to build up the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Ordinands in that church vow to do this. Our increased vision is increasingly of the whole church, not just our own part of it. I need hardly mention, but will do so as a second sign, how often churches act together in common prophetic witness and diaconia. That is perfectly clear. But other signs of flourishing are sometimes overlooked. For example, a third sign is our continuing and increasing common worship, as far as our respective ecclesial disciplines allow. Among Protestant churches within the ecumenical movement, ecclesial agreements now give full access to worship, including Eucharist, in most instances. Most churches, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, welcome each other's members to their services of the Word. And common services of the Word are now the norm, or at least very common, in ecumenical contexts. Through the liturgical renewal movement, many churches now share a common basic structure and language for worship, including for the Eucharist. The very hymns we sing testify to our oneness in Christ. Do you know that the standard Catholic hymnal in the United States includes the hymn "By Gracious Powers," a setting by a Methodist composer of a poem by Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Or do you know that the Disciples of Christ hymnal, Chalice hymnal, includes among its material for use in worship a poem by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon? You will hear the poem at the end of my presentation. A fourth sign is, of course, the breadth and depth of our bilateral dialogues and other conversations underway. As issues central to further progress, we have ended by identifying, I think, the most difficult. One reason we have moved slowly is that we have arrived at the issues that are precisely the most difficult. The nature of the church itself, in particular its sacramentality, and the validity and exercise of ministries within the church. Here there are signs of hope. For example, the notion of differentiated consensus is helping address the, for some churches, vexed question of the validity of ministries in Protestant churches. Also, Anglicans and Catholics are seeking new perspectives on the, for some, vexed question of the validity of Anglican ministerial orders. I mention a dialogue close to my own heart, the Disciples' Catholic Dialogue, underway since 1977, which has emerged as a model of irenic exploration and learning between two churches. Alone among Protestant churches, and from our beginning, disciples have understood the Eucharist, celebrated weekly, with Christ present at his table, as the center and foundation of our church's life. On this basis, our shared conviction of the centrality of the Eucharist and Christ's presence there, the Disciples' Catholic Dialogue seeks nothing less than the full visible unity of our two communions, to be expressed finally in common Eucharistic celebration. A fifth sign of ecumenical flourishing is the principle of mutual accountability, the simple but profound and challenging principle that we've moved beyond mutual recognition as members of Christ's body to the point where we feel ourselves now mutually accountable to one another within that one body of Christ. The fact that we need each other to be together fully the one church of Jesus Christ has consequences. For example, that churches need to consider the impact of their own internal decisions upon other churches and the effect of their own decisions upon their ecumenical relationships. Of course, churches must finally act according to their own conviction and conscience, but we do feel a new sense of responsibility to our partners within the body of Christ. A sixth sign, the powerful witness offered by church leaders speaking together. From the mission movement comes the text, Christian Witness in a Multi-Religious World. Recommendations issued jointly by the World Council of Churches, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, and the World Evangelical Alliance in 2011, produced with strong input from evangelical churches. It is a most hopeful sign of increasing cooperation among a wider and wider range of churches. While seen as a tool for mission agencies rather than a policy or theological statement, it focuses on the proclamation of the gospel as our common task, on mutual respect among the churches engaging in mission together, and above all, on respect for those to whom we bring our message of salvation in Jesus Christ. And from the church's concern for creation comes another example, the remarkable joint message for the protection of creation, issued in 2021, just last year, by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, Pope Francis, and Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin. They wrote, "This is the first time the three of us feel compelled to address together the urgency of environmental sustainability, its impact on persistent poverty, and the importance of global cooperation. Speaking truth to power, as we say, the statement is most pointed in its appeal, quote, to those with more far-reaching responsibilities. That is, persons heading administrations, persons running companies, employing people, or investing funds. To those people we say, choose people-centered profits, make short-term sacrifices to safeguard all our futures, become leaders in the transition to just and sustainable economies. To whom much is given, much is required." As a seventh sign, I mention a couple of efforts to broaden the ecumenical table. For example, the Global Christian Forum, which brings together an exceptional breadth of Christian traditions and organizations, including many not traditionally engaged ecumenically. And this has spawned parallel initiatives in local contexts. For example, Christian Churches Together in the United States, now regarded as the, quote, broadest fellowship of Christian communions in the country. Such groups offer an important chance for church and Christian groups to gain mutual understanding, to broaden the ecumenical discussion, and, where possible, to offer common witness. Thus far, they have been very circumspect because of the very breadth of membership, of essaying into theological discussions. I want now to conclude these signs of ecumenical flourishing with two of special importance. So the eighth sign is the Second Faith and Order Convergence text, the Church Towards a Common Vision, issued in 2013 by the Faith and Order Commission after long years of reflection by Protestant Orthodox and very much Catholic theologians. It represents the ecumenical movement's most recent effort to say together what we can say together about the one Church of Jesus Christ, and equally to name the problems still to be solved in order that our unity may be visible, convincing, and effective in witness and service to the world. It draws especially on recent faith and order work, Protestant, Catholic, and Reformed, on baptism as the basis for our common belonging to Christ's church, and stresses the missionary nature of the church. Its central achievement, I believe, is in exploring, in light of 30 years of bilateral and other discussions since BEM, the classic joint working group statement of, I quote, "the ecclesial elements required for full communion within a visibly united church as the goal of the ecumenical movement. These elements are communion in the fullness of apostolic faith, communion in sacramental life, communion in a truly one and mutually recognized ministry, communion in structures of conciliar relations and decision-making, and communion in common witness and service in the world." Especially helpful, I think, is the clear discussion of our inability to agree as yet on a pattern of ministry to serve the wholeness of the one church of Jesus Christ. The text recognizes that we agree, as it says, more or less explicitly on the threefold pattern of episkopos, presbyteros, and diakonos. But we remain divided as to whether the historic episcopate, that is, bishops ordained in apostolic succession, is necessary. It is helpful to clarify questions, if we have the courage to do so, and to state them as succinctly as possible. I would put the question this way: is a specific form of ordained ministry itself a part of divine revelation, intrinsic to the nature of the church? Or, while the calling and mission of the church are divine, may the church be called to assume different institutional forms in different historical circumstances. The Church Towards a Common Vision was published now a surprising 9 years ago. As with BEM, all the responses, from churches most importantly, but also from councils of churches and other groups, have been published, together with an initial and now a final summary of what we seem to have learned from the process. This last document is "What are the churches saying about the church?" ? Key findings and proposals from the responses to the Church Towards a Common Vision. It is, if you will, our response to the responses. It is remarkable in several ways, but not least in view of the harsh critiques I was so bold to refer to a few moments ago. Remarkable in acknowledging the critiques of traditional ecumenism, which we heard earlier from the global Christianity movement. And I quote from the response to the responses: "The Faith and Order Commission, recognizing that so much of world Christianity has not engaged with the text of the Church Towards a Common Vision, or with the ecumenical conversation on ecclesiology, recognizing that, has set out intentionally and proactively to engage more churches from regions and from traditions that represent some of the fastest growing parts of global Christianity, but whose voices have not always been clearly or strongly part of the conversation. This is an essential and urgent part of the future ecumenical reception of the Church Towards a Common Vision, and of the whole ecumenical movement. A movement which sorely needs the voices of those who have not historically been part of it if it is truly to be in every sense ecumenical and to speak within and for global Christianity. At the same time, Faith and Order has recently pursued studies on moral discernment, attempting to tackle the sensitive ethical and moral issues which cause so much division today among churches and within individual churches themselves. These studies, it is important to note, do not take stands on particular issues. Their goal is to seek to help churches understand the ways in which they and other churches make and arrive at their respective decisions as a basis for the church's further work together. Miriam Motions, a Catholic scholar, has been especially important in that work, and I want to note that. Lastly, I want to mention two of Faith and Order's most recent texts in offering final examples of how Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox churches are together engaging today's ecumenical challenges. The first is the text, Cultivate and Care, from 2020, an ecumenical theology of justice for and within creation. The thrust of that text is obvious. The second text is called Towards a Global Vision of the Church, Volume 1, Explorations on Global Christianity and Ecclesiology. And that is nothing less than a direct engagement with the global Christianity movement. And now, happily, a fifth and final and vibrant sign to conclude these examples of ecumenical flourishing. This is none other than the ecumenical quest of Pope Francis, which I consider a gift to the whole of Christ Church. Again, we are in Brian Farrell's debt for showing us Pope Francis' path to ecumenism. I quote Bishop Brian. In Francis' vision of the Church, Christian unity plays a central part. But it was not always that way. Pope Francis came to ecumenism by way of a personal conversion, inspired by his personal contacts among a wide range of Catholics and non-Catholics alike in Buenos Aires. As I remember, charismatic Catholics, evangelical and other Protestants, and a Jewish rabbi were all involved in Pope Francis' path to ecumenism. I like to think of Pope Francis as having the enthusiasm of a convert to the ecumenical cause. I mean this entirely positively, and if I may put it this way, it endears him to me. As one example, I cite his reference to non-Catholic Christians at Vespers in the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, marking the opening of the 2019 Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. And I quote, "It is a grave sin to belittle or despise the gifts that the Lord has given our brothers and sisters, and to think that God somehow holds them in less esteem. We must acknowledge the value of the grace granted to other Christian communities." And in particular, I note his remarks during his visit in 2018 to the World Council of Churches, calling us to ask ourselves, what can we do together if a particular form of service is possible? Why not plan and carry it out together, and thus start to experience a more intense fraternity in the exercise of concrete charity? And so we've come full circle, with Pope Francis affirming that touchstone of the ecumenical movement, the Lund Principle of 1951, that churches acting together should be the norm of our Christian life rather than the exception. And now, in conclusion, I spoke earlier about the 20th century as the century in which the churches rediscovered their ecumenical vocation. My further conviction is that the 21st century, our century, will be the century in which the churches realize that vocation and become truly the one church of Jesus Christ. Through the grace of God, we have achieved a great deal, but we dare not remain satisfied with our present ecumenical structures and meetings and texts, important as they are. Perhaps our greatest challenge is to be open and ready for the ecumenical future God has in store for us. And perhaps our greatest temptation is to grow hard and remain fixed within our present language and in our present state. So let me conclude, as I promised earlier, with that poem from St. Irenaeus of Lyon. I am reading it, and is not this itself a sign of ecumenical hope? I am reading it from the Chalice Hymnal, the hymnal of my own church, the Disciples of Christ. After all that we have heard this evening about ecumenical fundamentals, challenges, and achievements, let St. Irenaeus linger in your mind and heart as an inspiration and a challenge for you personally, but also for the ecumenical movement today. It is not you who shape God. It is God that shapes you. If then you are the work of God, await the hand of the artist who does all things in due season. Offer the potter your heart, soft and tractable, and keep the form in which the artist has fashioned you. Let your clay be moist, lest you grow hard and lose the imprint of the potter's fingers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that very comprehensive presentation. So we have a moment if anyone wants to ask some questions to Tom.
I'm Bohumil Bečić, a journalist from, Slovakia, ex-Czechoslovakia, and we would say in ex-communist countries like mine that the winter is coming from the east. Well, the cold, all these things that are negative. And so I would like to ask about the example of a crack in communism and within the Orthodox Church with the current war in Ukraine, because we know what's going on, and many see that this is really, as I use the word crack, and you mentioned Pope Francis as an example again. Many other people, even theologians in various churches, see that he was wrong regarding the Catholic Orthodox relations, that with what's going on over there, with the kind of justification of the war, with various suggestions that it's good to die for the country in Ukraine, that people will go, and so on and so forth. So this is the first question. The second question is, you mentioned but then did not develop that we have the answers, but the secular world stopped asking them. But the thing is that the world, everyone asked the same questions over and over and again. Personal, deep questions that everyone has to be confronted with, even later or sooner. But so I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more on that.
These are both, yes, deep and difficult questions. I am not competent to speak about the first question. As an American citizen sitting in the United States, my response is visceral against the invasion of Ukraine. And my own pastor in my own church lost 4 of his grandparents in the 1930s in Ukraine. So I hear something every week of his personal anguish and the suffering of the people. There are always difficulties in the identification of a particular religious community with the state. And many of us, and the Orthodox I know in Boston, where I live at the moment, are highly critical of the, I have to say, Russian Orthodox Church and its stance, seemingly somewhat on the side of the aggression. Beyond that, there's little I can say. I'm sorry, but my sympathies are completely with the Ukrainian people. And I know the church situation is difficult because there are multiple Orthodox churches involved. And that is part of a very long history in itself. And the situation is making that only more difficult and tragic. I should say also within the Orthodox Church in America, which is, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church in the United States, granted autonomy, autocephaly by Moscow, but not by other Orthodox churches. The persons I know within the Orthodox Church in America are also critical of the actions of the Russian Orthodox. I hope this addresses a little bit your question. And the second thing is, yes, I think deep down, profoundly, people do ask the same questions, the fundamental questions about the meaning of life and why am I here? And what is my vocation? Not just my job, and where do I find my meaning in life? But one of the temptations of secular society is that it is highly skillful at distracting us from real questions and keeping us as far as possible on the surface of consumerism and entertainment, let's say. So I'm not saying that secular culture determines the witness of the church. That's the last thing I want to say. And to some extent, the church has always lived in a secular culture, which has, in fact, sought to belittle or diminish or simply ignore, which is often the most effective form of denial, to ignore the witness of the church. I wanted to be aware that for centuries, we lived in an understanding of Christendom, and especially in the United States at this moment, where there are persons who are tempted simply to identify their political beliefs with a particular understanding of the Christian faith. And I think one of the good things of the founding of our country was, in fact, the separation of church and state, which was not an action against religious faith. It was an action against the temptation of secular states to impose religious traditions, which they might have adopted out of convenience, upon the people. That is what they felt they had experienced under the rule of England, of course, and why they rebelled. You could reverse what I was trying to say and say that the present situation actually gives us the challenge and opportunity to help people rediscover what their ultimate questions actually are, and perhaps to unmask and to unmask some of the illusions of a radically secularizing culture. So I preferred to see the situation as hope, but wanted to put it, fairly strongly as a challenge.
My name is Matthew Lafferty. I'm the director of the Methodist Ecumenical Office. I serve as the co-secretary of the Methodist Roman Catholic International Commission.
I actually know that.
There are many questions I could ask. I'm particularly curious around earlier references you had to united and uniting churches. And certainly we see in the last 30 or 40 years the move to united and uniting churches has waned than it did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. And yet these churches still exist and create, I think, a new reality for the ecumenical movement. Even seen very recently at the General Assembly in Karlsruhe, the organizing united and uniting churches fully and completely as a confessional family, which had never been seen before, raises exciting opportunities for reflection about what that means for us, but also challenges for people like me who work clearly within a confessional structure, knowing that we have churches that are member churches within multiple confessional families. I guess my question is more, how do you see maybe these churches offering a continuing vision for the ecumenical movement, or renewed? I'm hesitant to use renewed because that presupposes that there are things that need to go away. But how do you see them within the life of the ecumenical movement?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because for many years their witness was precisely the fact that they had united or were on the way to do so. But 30 years after that, that is not that's the witness they offer from their past, and there's a courageous and excellent aspect to that. So I think they simply live now as ecclesial bodies, as churches, and make their witness as best they think fit. And they do it as united and uniting churches, in which, as Leslie Newbigin put so poignantly, the riches of a variety of Christian traditions are there at hand to be experienced. And there's something also about the nature of making a commitment for reunion. The very memorable Martin Cressy, who was member of the United Reformed Church, longtime member of Faith and Order, and who wrote impeccable English of sentences 50 words long without a single punctuation mark, but perfectly lucid, absolutely clearly structurally organized. And he spoke about a certain closing the gap among and between churches which had been in a uniting process and now have become a single ecclesial body. You can no longer say to one another, well, sort of. We are now members of a single ecclesial body and responsible in the most intimate way to one another for the decisions we make, because we are now a single united church. It is interesting to speculate about the fading of energy in unions. I remember when the ELCA in the United States was formed, from 3 Lutheran traditions in the early 80s. They had something like 80 committees as a part of this union process. And in the end effect, the most difficult problems were reconciling not theological doctrines, but pension plans. And entirely practical activities of daily living for churches as institutions. And I think in many cases, and especially as the numbers of the faithful began and now in some places continue to wane, energy has been diverted to survival, understandably. And it's often ecumenical budgets and sometimes worship budgets that are cut earliest in the life of churches. So I think they do best and make their best witness by being themselves as churches which do, in fact, combine multiple Christian values and traditions.
One of the chief questions that Father Congar raised when he spoke about the unity of the Church, well, first, the acknowledgement that the Church is one, that is part of its ontological reality in the image and likeness of the Holy Trinity, but that the unity of those who belong to the Church, Christians, is a journey that is an eschatological journey. And so that he had this whole dimension of the eschatology of the quest for Christian unity, which doesn't mean to say that, okay, so we'll just wait until Christ comes back again in glory. No, because again, he had the understanding that this is a pilgrim church already living that which had been given to them, but now trying to perfect it.
Yes.
Yeah. Our dear friend, Orthodox John Zizioulas, yes, is trying to put the final period on his magisterial study on eschatology. So I think, in this time of Advent, the sign of hope is that, first of all, we realize that the gift is already here, but that we are the ones who are impeding on allowing it to become visible and real in our lives. And I think, that has to do with, I think, something that you said about secularization, etc. Because when secularization takes over in the churches, it's just a warning sign that your symbols, your language, your concepts no longer are fulfilling what religion is supposed to do in society. That is to give us a lasting hope and find deeper meaning. Okay, so secularization is a neutral term, but it's a warning sign, whereas secularism is a total disregard for religion. And I think that if we realize that and take that seriously about how we are actually thinking about those which are the main concepts of our faith and how we express it and live it. Your poem from Irenaeus and some of the early fathers, Augustine, would say something along the same line, that this is the task of the churches together today, to find a new language to speak into the world, a language that comes from our experience of our communion already, as you said, and one that will challenge the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, what you gave us to reflect on is a task that we have to do now. That's why I liked your image of saying about the winter, that it's a time for laying fallow, but it's a time that also germinates those things which now need to come to fruition.
Exactly. I believe that Luther said something to the effect, we pray as if everything depended on God, which it does, but we have to act as though a great deal actually depends on us. So we recognize that God has the ultimate say and in fact gives us the power, whatever power we have, to work. But, of course, yes, we and the churches themselves must make it happen, in fact, and realize the gift we've been given. And thank you for the actually linguistic comment, because what I had been talking about was secularism, actually. Yep.
I find that in many church documents, there's a mass confusion. Coming from a sociological background, I understand what secularization is all about, but we confuse that. And if you look at a lot of documents, when they're talking about secularization, they're talking about secularism, but it's a total disregard for religion. Excellent. But secularization is not that. It's just a warning sign saying, hey, your symbols, your language is not doing what it is supposed to do to provide this part, this sector of society to find its meaning. And it's a heavy task for religion, because it's a task that means that we find a deeper understanding of the meaning of what it means to be human, and to be part of a society that contributes something for the good of others.
Yes. And it requires courage on the part of churches. I think it was the year 2000 when the effectively state Lutheran Church of Sweden disestablished itself, saying we recognize the warning signs. We have to teach ourselves skills of mission, which we've not had to use, or we've taken for granted. The more or less automatic baptisms that have happened because of our position as a state church. We have taken for granted our generally affirmed status within society. And we are now in a mission situation in Sweden.
We have some participants from online, people that you might know. First is a comment from Gillian Kingston. A fantastic presentation and most encouraging. I hope that we may see the text for further reflection on these things. And of course, Gillian, you will see this text. It'll be in our spring bulletin. Now, the next comes from a dear friend of both Tom and myself, Diane Kessler.
Diane.
In the context of the United States, many congregations, especially in the post-COVID world, are shrinking. I recently met a United Church of Christ minister who had served a united congregation of the ELCA Lutherans and members of the UCC. The possibility of more unions of one sort or another seems promising, but I suspect either it isn't on the screen or feels threatening. What would you say to religious leaders or local clergy that could help them see the possibilities of such an approach in this age?
Wow. Hello, Diane, and thank you for attending. It's great to know that you are there and have been there. If it's actually a question of church union processes, For me, the most important thing is to show local pastors and denominational executives, for that matter, that if done properly, a church union is an action in enrichment, in which parties gain access to the wealth of traditions outside their own and within a single ecclesial framework, which is a different and more intimate and more significant, I believe, way of experiencing the riches of other traditions. Because once a union is formed, they are now the riches of my own tradition, not just another denomination's over there. They are now the riches of my own church as well. I think we sell the union initiative short, perhaps because we now are so used to cooperating in acts of service and witness locally. Perhaps that tempts us to become stuck at that point and be content with that, with common witness, and not go further to reflect on the possibility of exploring doctrinal issues together and perhaps looking towards some kind of structural union even.
Thank you. We still have people online that want to get in here, so let's let them get in. This is a response. It is a matter of claiming what already is possible by actions already taken at official settings. This was from Diane. This is from our Associate Director, Teresa Francesca Rossi, who is at home. We have a lot of convalescing people here, so this is what she says. Thank you very, very much for this great presentation and for providing us substantial issues to reflect upon together with many concrete examples, and definitely for the hope My question is about ecumenical formation. Given the new challenges that the ecumenical movement is facing, there is, it seems to me, a need to reshape the profile of ecumenical formation in terms of epistemological approach, of concrete topics addressed, of relational aspects. At the same time, young generations are still in need of receiving the ABCs of ecumenism. What would be, in your opinion, a fruitful path to follow in order to refresh ecumenical formation in the light of the contemporary situation? Un grande saluto e un grande grazie.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. It's lovely to know you've been with us. I think there could be two aspects to this approach, to a new approach. One would be in situations of, let's say, formal formation, so seminaries, places where pastors are being formed, pastors are being trained. And there the responsibility is for that particular seminary to engage in practical ecumenical experiences as well as teaching the fundamentals of ecumenical history, which start in biblical times. Ecumenical history is at the Faith and Order World Conference in Montreal. The Roman Catholic biblical scholar Raymond Brown gave a brilliant paper showing the essential unity of the New Testament texts. And then the equally distinguished Protestant biblical scholar Ernst Käsemann gave a brilliant paper showing the vast, bewildering diversity of views and trajectories of thought and witness within the early churches. the issue, for example, the issue of diversity and unity, questions of legitimate diversity, these have been with us since the very beginning. And the book of Acts is nowhere, there is no better place than the book of Acts to start a discussion of unity and diversity within the church. I think seminaries could do well to look to their own resources in teaching church history and biblical subjects, and providing students with practical ecumenical experience. And there is a second angle which could take place at the local level in local parishes, because most ecumenical churches are now deeply involved in local councils of churches and at many different levels and contexts. And those can be made more intentional, and I would hope more theologically based. Often it's only a matter of collaboration and common work. And I think that should be supplemented, also at the level of local church projects, by some period of biblical reflection, theological reflection. Why are we doing this? What is our absolute basis? And I remember Bishop Munib Yunin, who was the head of the president of the Lutheran World Federation and the bishop in Lebanon, I believe, and Jerusalem, I believe, who said the value of ecumenical texts was that they tell us, speaking from point of view of his own church, they tell us who we are and whose we are. We are not a social service agency. We belong to Jesus Christ, and that is our identity and motivation. And secondly, ecumenical texts remind us that we are not alone in our mission and ministry and witness. There is a worldwide, literally, fellowship of churches which is supporting us. And that is essential if we are to witness and serve in our context. So I would stress practical engagement, but also tradition and education, learning about our own tradition.
Well, thank you once again, Tom, for sharing your thoughts, your reflections, and certainly the presentation you made this evening is a sign of how committed you are to this prayer of Jesus, that we pray that all may become one so that the world may believe, which I think is the ultimate goal. Now, you mentioned something about mutual accountability. You know, the center is running a program called MAD, Mutual Accountability Desk, which deals about how we are accountable to each other. The first MAD was on preaching. The second series was on baptism, and the third one, which we are in right now, is on synodality. How do we become a synodical church? So we invite our listeners to be aware, because we'll be coming after you with some of these goals. And our next activities will be an online prayer vigil by the directors of the Anglican Center, Archbishop Ian, and the director of the Methodist Ecumenical Office, Rome, Matthew, who is here, and yours truly, preparing and waiting for the beginning of the week of prayer. So look for that on our website. And on the 19th of January, our annual Week of Prayer celebration and lecture. This year, it will be given by Dr. Dirk Langer, who is a General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva, and he will speak about the recent study document between the Lutherans and the Catholics on baptism. So we invite you to stay tuned, look at our website, and get the calendar marked up and send in your link, but most especially if you're here in Rome, come and visit us. So we wish you all a very pleasant evening, and our best for the holidays coming up. Hanukkah is on the Sunday we begin, and of course, as we prepare for the Christmas celebration and the holidays here. So I hope you all have a very healthy and safe holiday, and enjoy that, and remember to pray for peace in the world. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you.